Welcome to yet another episode of Shortcast Over Coffee. Today, my guest is Dinesh Thakur. Dinesh trained as a chemical engineer before becoming a whistleblower against the pharmaceutical company Ranbaxy. While working at Ranbaxy, he witnessed extensive data fraud and reported this wrongdoing. His actions led Ranbaxy to plead guilty in an American court in 2013 to violating US law. The company paid $500 million dollars as penalty as part of its guilty plea. For his whistleblowing efforts, he received the Joe A. Callaway Award for Civic Courage and ACFE Cliff Robertson Sentinel Award. Since 2014, Dinesh has advocated reforming India's outdated Drugs and Cosmetics Act from 1940. He founded an advocacy group called Citizens for Affordable, Safe and Effective Medicine, CASEM, to campaign for these reforms. Dinesh also established the Thakur Family Foundation, a philanthropic organization that funds public health research and health journalism in India. He serves as the foundation's president. In this episode, I talk to Dinesh about the work of YK Hamid and Cipla, how India became the generic drug manufacturing capital of the world, and the pros and cons of it. We also talk about the Ranbaxy case and a few other important cases which expose the shady side of big pharma companies. So stay tuned for the episode. Do show your support to the show by subscribing on Spotify or wherever you get your podcast. And buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/shortcastovercoffee. That is buymeacoffee.com/shortcastovercoffee. Let's now get into the conversation with Dinesh. Hi, Dinesh. Welcome to the podcast.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I have a little story to say about how I came across your work and you. I did this wonderful episode with Murli Neelakanthan, ex Global General Counsel Cipla,
Yeah.
and he's told me about your book, and I was made aware of it, and then uh, the whole Fire in the Blood documentary about YK Hamid. And
Yeah.
then, it was all a rabbit hole where I got to know of, the truth pill and so on and so forth. I decided that, I need to talk to you and get to know more about your work. So here we are. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, kind of regret that I was not aware of the documentary Fire in the Blood earlier. But remarkable work that YK Hamid and Cipla did in Africa. So let's first start with Cipla. It's quite the legacy company. Started in 1935, gained a lot of prominence. When it started to make low cost generic versions of patented drugs. It also got a lot of backlash because it was violating a lot of policies, but then it continued, and I think YK Hamid is quite the hero in Africa. Looking back, what has been Cipla's major contribution to the world, and how has it made such a big difference?
I think that, nothing to take away from Hamid and Sipla's contribution, right? So I think that Sipla and Hamid were at the right place at the right time to be able to capitalize on this growing demand for affordable antiretrovirals. That's certainly one side of the story, and Dylan Mongray's documentary "Find the Blood" actually does a lot of justice to what really happened on that side. The story that is not actually told enough is about how PEPFAR came about, right? The money for purchasing ARVs essentially was allocated by the Bush administration through a program called PEPFAR. And the story that is, seldom, I mean, not so much told, in common folklore compared to, uh, Dr. Hamid and Cyprus' contribution is what people like Bill Haddad and what they did, to move the needle. Because remember, in those days, the companies that actually held the patent to these, life-saving drugs were big pharma companies, and they were selling these medicines for an ungodly amount of money. right? Which clearly even patients in the United States can afford. Forget about, people living in Africa. Um, AIDS epidemic was its peak. People in, cities like Philadelphia and New York, who were afflicted with this disease, they didn't have the means to buy medicine, and the big pharma basically said, tough luck, that's how it is going to be. If you want to survive, you'll end up paying hundreds of thousands of dollars to us. I think that Cipla and Hamid clearly were at the right place at the right time. And one of the challenges that I think that we see within the Indian industry is the people who are quote unquote promoters of pharma companies in India, right? They don't have background either in chemistry or biology. Very few of them do. A lot of these are people from family wealth who set up these, manufacturing facilities. Hamid was a Cambridge educated chemist, right? So he understood what was going on here. And I think that he was able to capitalize on what was happening. And so there were two sides to the story. One was the capability and the capacity of an Indian company to make this drug, which is very well captured in Dylan's movie, Fire in the Blood. The second part of it, which hopefully someday somebody will make a movie, is basically around how, you know, dogged activists like Bill basically persuaded the Bush administration to set aside a significant amount of money to buy these medicines, right? So I think that that's the other part of the story, which also needs to be told, because without PEPFAR, this wouldn't have happened. Right? A lot of money, U.S. taxpayer money, was spent, sort of buying these medicines and distributing these medicines from India. But be that as it may, I think that what it did was it created this notion of the fact that you were able to supply medicines, life-saving medicines, at a fraction of a cost, right? But if you go through and read the history of what really happened at that point in time, these pharma companies, which basically were beaten into a corner, right? And rather than charging hundreds of thousands of dollars, for life-saving medications for HIV patients, they were willing to give up that patent, sort of a protection outside of the United States. But they also knew that once you open that door, very little could have prevented those medicines from making their way back into the United States, right? So the way that they prevented that was basically said, you know what? If you were to sell, if the same companies were to sell the medicines in the United States, they need to have approval from the US FDA. To the extent that they also said that if US taxpayer money was being used to buy these medicines, you needed an approval from the US FDA in order for the US taxpayers through the USAID program, which is the PEPFAR sort of operational arm. Before it spent money, US taxpayer money, they needed to have an approval from the US FDA, because they figured that it at least will throw a wrench into the works. Because how many Indian companies will actually get an approval from the US FDA, right? We'll throw them back. Even if you can push them back a year, that's 1 year's worth of full profits for us to make, right? But they did not count on the ingenuity of Indian chemists who were able to sort of develop this capacity very, very quickly, and reverse engineer a lot of these medicines, which essentially became, the story of the fire and the blood, right? So I think that's the story that we always kind of look back and think about the contribution of Indian generic pharma industry to, the world of medicine as to what we were able to do. Now, that opened the gates, because I think that what it told the Indian industry was, look, there was a market. Yes, you wouldn't be selling your drugs for what big pharma sold, right? But you could still make a decent profit, right? Even if you sold at $100 a day for a pill, right? In those days, imagine a dollar was what, 17, 18 rupees? I mean, it's not like it's 83 or 84 right now. At 17, 18 rupees, a day, you could still make a profit if you did it properly, right? And so they said, fine, we will go ahead and do that, and we'll still make a decent amount of money. And I think that a lot of sort of kudos goes to, the people in PEPFAR and Biladad and those guys who negotiated and said, like, you need to be in business. This model will only work if you guys make money, if you become profitable, right? If you sustain yourself, right? to be able to do that. That's how the generic industry came about. And I think that what people learned from what Cipla did, right? And they said, look, if Cipla can do it, what is stopping us from doing it, right? So a lot of these Indian generic pharma industries that was basically supplied to the local market, it opened their eyes to the fact that there's a huge market outside of India that they could cater to, right? So that basically created this whole notion of India supplying generic medicines to the world. So that's how it got started.
Yeah, Cipla clearly played a key role in establishing India as the pharmacy of the developing world, so to speak. You mentioned about reverse engineering, and I also heard you mention, not in this particular podcast but elsewhere, that no major drug has been discovered in India. And I was looking at the list of billionaires of who own Indian pharma companies, and uh, this is a statistic from 2021, and I see that India has 15 pharma billionaires in the top 100, and their net worth is over 85 billion. And a lot of the times when the question is asked that why doesn't India invest a lot on R&D, the answer is that India does not have the amount of capital to invest. Uh, but but the statistics say otherwise, lots of billionaires in the top 100. So where do you think the gap is? Why hasn't India been able to sort of pioneer drug discovery research?
So there are two aspects to this, right? How do you have an ecosystem that actually does innovation? Now, let's take a step behind. Let's take a step back, right? And ask about innovation more broadly, not just in the pharmaceutical space. And we'll zoom in on the pharmaceutical space in a bit. Other than the pharmaceutical industry, which earns a lot of foreign exchange revenue for us in India, the other big industry that we have that earns a lot of foreign revenue is IT services, right? Now, can you tell me how many innovative IT services programs have we developed, has India developed, and actually given to the world?
Very
Right?
few. I think, I mean, most of them have been the Indian version of a
Right.
Walmart or an
Right.
Amazon. Yeah, yeah.
Right. And so the question here is that why is innovation not a feature of our economy? That's a question that needs to be asked, right? Because in order for you to develop drugs, two things have to happen. You have to have the skill, right? You have to have people who understand how to do drug discovery, right? And what does drug discovery take? It takes people understanding of biology, it takes understanding of chemistry, right? And people who understand how to put those two things together, right? That's what drug discovery takes. So the first thing you need is qualified people who understand, who are good at biology and chemistry. That's one thing. The second thing, it needs capital, right? Remember, drug discovery is a long game. If you know anything about developing new medicines, this is a process that is the failure is inherent in this, right? 1 in 10 projects actually make it to the market. 1 in 10, right? And each project requires a 10-year development cycle, because even if you have a viable drug candidate, whether it's a biological or a chemical, the process of establishing its safety and efficacy in a clinic, it's something that needs 3 to 4 years, right? This is the FDA approval process. You go through first establishing the dose, then the safety of that particular thing, then the efficacy of that in a large scale clinical trial. That takes many, many years. So, in a process that actually has 90% failure rate and takes 10 to 12 years to actually come to the market, imagine the kind of investment that you would need and the patience that you need to have to sustain that investment over the 10, 12-year period of time, right? Indian entrepreneurs, Indian big families who own, Indian billionaires who own, pharmaceutical companies, they just do not have the patience or the capacity to make such investments. They look for return on capital in 24 months. That's their threshold, right? So typically, if you look at the list of billionaires that you talked about here, right, the people who own large foreign companies, if you look at their investment thresholds, if you look at their annual reports, right, if you read the annual reports and the messages that they have in terms of where they see the companies going, their threshold for return on capital is 24 months. Well, you cannot do drug discovery in 24 months. That's the first thing, right? The second thing is, do we really have the skills to be able to develop new drugs? Certainly, we have chemistry skills, right? Without the chemistry skills, we would not have had the generic industry that we have in the country, right? But we do not have, we've never invested in proper biology. Now, I'm sure many of your listeners who have taken science in high school, they will, if you think back, how many times did you actually have a proper biology lab, right? You had a chemistry lab. You had salts that you were, playing with, that you were asked to identify what was sodium chloride, potassium chloride, and if you add, certain, alkaline mixture to it, it turns blue or green, things of that nature. You certainly had chemistry, right? But did we really have proper molecular biology labs? Did we have proper microscopes? Did we have proper books and teachers that actually taught us how organic biochemistry actually works, right? How many of us actually do that or did
Yeah,
that,
yeah, that is
right?
so true because I talked to a few of my friends who chose biotechnology. You know, they did biotechnology in for their undergrad, but most of them after that just moved to the US or chose IT jobs, or they eventually went on to become JRF, junior research fellows. But then they say that establishing a lab, or like you said, acquiring equipments for their lab is a very tedious process, involves a lot of red tapeism, and the pay is pretty abysmal, to be honest. So I think, yeah.
So those are the two factors. If you think about why, you know, we've never been able to develop a innovation-based pharmaceutical industry, this is the reason why. And the challenge is this, right? Even if you look at the United States, most of basic innovation happens at the university level, right? Most of the basic innovation happens with the help of the National Science Foundation grants. If you look at the way that India actually, engenders, innovation, we do it through what's called the Department of Science and Technology. Now, this is the department that actually gives out grants to PhDs, PhD students, postdocs who work in the universities. Last time I was in India, I actually went and spoke to a bunch of these people and say, okay, what is your biggest issue? They don't even get paid on time. Forget about access to proper lab facilities. Access to journals, for example. We're still a low and middle income country, right? Access to Elsevier journals is an expensive thing for us. As a country, we never think about buying a countrywide license and making it available to all universities so that the students can actually look up most up to date scientific literature. We just don't have access to that. These are fundamental things that we don't think about when we talk about, how do you create an ecosystem that fosters, building skills. Now, if you do not provide proper labs, if you do not provide, proper, basic things like paying people on time, if you don't pay postdocs on time, if you don't pay our PhD students on time, right? If you don't give them access to journals, how the hell are you going to expect them to innovate? And this is not a new problem. This is something that what I'm telling you is nothing new. This is something that's been known for a long period of time. And then even, if you look at the kind of schemes the government runs, right, and you apply for it, go talk to somebody who's gotten a DST grant, right? And ask them, okay, can you tell us what the grant process looks like? Well, the grant process is administered not by people who understand how innovation works. It's administered by some babu, some IAS guy who's sitting in the Ministry of Science and Technology. Now, if you apply for a grant, the first thing he'll ask you is, what collateral are you going to provide to me in order for me to give you a 50 lakh grant? Now, tell me, what collateral would a startup entrepreneur provide in order to get a 50 lakh grant to set up a lab?
Yeah, he wouldn't have much.
And this is the reason why 80% of the national grants from DST go to people like Biocon, to Sun Pharma, because they're able to provide those collaterals. The question is, do they really need money from the government to be able to do this kind of work?
Not really, yeah.
Right? So these are some of the questions that I think that we don't talk about enough to try and understand why we fail so miserably when it comes to innovation, right? I'm not talking about just pharmaceuticals. I'm talking about a startup structure even within information technology, right? Again, Tell me what innovation have we produced, for a country of 1.4 billion people that we can point out and say, this is unique to us. We made this happen.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, yeah, I'm thinking of Zerodha, which is a knockoff of Robin Hood, Flipkart, Walmart. Yeah, yeah. I mean, the
Pinnacle,
list.
which is something that we say, it's a knockoff of Oracle and SAP,
Right.
right? My point is different. My point is that unless you change the way that we encourage the ecosystem, right, and empower young people to be able to think in ways that gives them the safety net to take the risks, right? Innovation will not flourish in the country, right? You get a young kid, 20, 25-year-old kid applying for a grant to innovation in software, and the first thing that person is asked is, what collateral do you provide? What collateral do you think they have? Laptops?
Yeah. So true. I mean, yeah, yeah. I think, yeah, I was actually going through the list of billionaires, like I was mentioning earlier, and it was fascinating that only the Indian billionaires had this thing that XYZ and family,
Yeah.
and so on. I think the case was true for Jindal and so on and so forth. I
Yeah.
think, yeah,
So
only Nikhil Kamath, maybe Nikhil Kamath and a few others were sort of self-made billionaires. And I sometimes wonder why that is. Like, do we, as a culture, I don't know if it's a culture problem or an attitude problem where we always want the wealth to stay in the family, not much of philanthropy going around.
I don't know whether that's true though, because I think that if you do look at, for example, Azim Premji and Nilakani Foundation, right? Both of them, do a lot of work, right? But the need in the country is so huge that even people with deep pockets like Premji and Nilakani, even if they invest as much as they do, they're able to address this. I think what, if I understand correctly, if you look at both Nilakani and Premji, their focus is more on solving social problems because the need is so huge, right? They are not looking necessarily at an innovation point of view, right? They are addressing basic issues of water, food, shelter, right? Education. Those are systemic problems for us even after. It doesn't matter when we say we are celebrating 75 years of independence, Amritkal, what nonsense. But fact is that 800 million people still require 5 kilograms of ration at the end of the day. I mean, if that is what we call Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav, I don't know what to say.
Yeah, that is so true. I think we also have to mention the names of people who have signed the Giving Pledge. I think the Nilekani Foundation, Nikhil Kamath, and so many people. Azim Premji comes to mind. So yeah, I mean, but like you said, they are solving a lot more social problems or fundamental problems that need attention at this time, and that also makes sense.
Yes, right. But the point I'm trying to say is again, like, it's up to the government to create this ecosystem, right? What happens in the United States is not that private philanthropy funds this, right? Once you have an idea that is proven in the lab at the university level, is where venture capital, private equity, these guys come in and license it out and then invest in it and developing it, right? But the basic research of what really happens is largely funded by NIH, right? We don't have anything equivalent to NIH. Even if we have something equivalent, even a small version of that, we administer it so poorly that the people who really need that don't get it. Instead, what happens is that the big guys, they end up walking away with the lion's share of the grants the government gives, and they're the last people who really need that.
Yeah. Yeah, that is so true. Yeah, you mentioned about regulations, and your book, The Truth Pill, discusses about the lack of regulations in India. And I came across several articles of similar instances that happened in the U.S. I mean, one of the examples that strikes me is Biogen in September 2022. There was a settlement of 900 million with due to the allegations that Biogen paid kickbacks to doctors to induce them to prescribe its multiple sclerosis drugs. And then there was another instance of Eli Lilly, where a former HR lead filed a lawsuit reporting, manufacturing problems and so on, not compliant with FDA procedures. We see these examples in the US, and I think I'm just thinking back at my episode with Murli Neelakantan, who mentioned that Indian quality control is super bad, and then there is a little more honor system and a lot more control in the US. And you hear these cases in the US as well. How do you compare the quality control or such issues between India and so-called developed country like the US?
So I mean, look, to be very honest, I can only speak, as my knowledge is directly related to medicines, right? I think that the quality issue is much broader, much broader, right? So we have to, say that, and I'm not qualified to talk about, product quality or service quality in the broader industry context, because I think that there's more to it than pharmaceutical product quality. But the fact remains is that, after 75 years, the only example that we as Indians can point to and say that this is a success story in manufacturing for us as a country is pharmaceuticals. Tell me which other, what other, product have we created for export?
Definitely not automobiles. Yeah, nothing else. Maybe software, but that too low quality stuff. Yeah,
Software is mostly sold as a service,
service. Yeah, yeah, that's
right?
true. Yeah.
It's software as a service, right? Because even if there's a product is bundled along with support infrastructure for service, but like a hard product, we don't have any, right? So because of that, I think that our political class is so afraid of even sort of acknowledging that there's a problem with this industry, because they
Because
think
it's a success story.
because it's the only success story. If for example, if you, I'll give a simple example, right? Last year around this time, um, at this point in time, in October, in a small country in West Africa, in a country called Gambia, 66 children died after consuming cough syrup that was made in India. And when the Gambian authorities actually, when the World Health Organization issued a medical products alert, our initial reaction was, how dare you even point a finger to us? It is you who should have tested the product before you gave it to your children. This was an official response of the government of India to the World Health Organization, the Gambia, saying, you are at fault here. You didn't test the product before you gave it to your children, and your children died. So that's your problem, not ours. This is the kind of knee-jerk reaction. Now, tell me what product that you buy, that you use, after paying good money for it, that you test it yourselves before using it.
Nothing. You just trust the brand. You just trust the manufacturing process and quality
So the
control. Yeah.
point is that the hubris that comes with that, right, tells you that they are so prickly about anybody pointing a finger at this industry. I mean, look, that was the initial reaction. Over a period of time, the Parliamentary Standing Committee in Gambia, they basically dispelled this nonsense. They held they conducted a detailed inquiry, looked at autopsies, looked at, sent the sample to labs in Switzerland, and in Ghana, and got it tested and proved that this was a product, that actually had contaminant. My point is not that. They shut up after a while, right? Because, that initial hubris about how dare you even question us vanished when confronted with data. My point here is that because we see that as our only sort of example, whatever, to be able to say, hey, look, this is what we have. Anybody who points a finger at them, our reaction is that, how dare you? How dare you say that we don't, our products are not good? How dare you point out to us that we don't produce good products? Now, that does not engender confidence in building quality. Look, even in the best manufacturing facilities in Europe and United States, there are problems. Have you heard of this infant formula issue that we had in the United States last year? So Abbott, is the largest supplier of infant formula in the United States. During the peak of COVID, they found that their manufacturing facility up in Illinois had contamination, and they had a couple of baby deaths. It was a huge issue, it blew up. There was a shortage of baby formula to the extent that the president of the country actually intervened, and lifted up import ban to import infant formula from Germany, from Europe. We never do that, right? The point I'm trying to make here is that Abbott would have said, how dare you say, how dare you say that our product caused this? Is that the way to address quality-related issues? There are problems. When you make a product, doesn't matter if you make a mechanical product, a drug product, a software product, you will have bugs. The way that you address that is acknowledge the fact that, yes, we made a mistake. We'll figure out why it happened. We'll institute procedures to make sure it never happens again. Right? It took Abbott 8 months to clean up. There's a huge investigative reporting on that. They got penalized by the US FDA. And in the meantime, they found out that the FDA did not have enough inspectors to inspect those kind of facilities that were producing, infant formula. So the government gave them enough resources to say, look, we don't want this kind of situation to happen again, in our country. That's the way to solve problems and inspire confidence in your product. Not by, basically sort of threatening people who say, your product causes harm. Right? That is our reaction.
Yeah, I mean, another example that comes to mind is the Chicago Tylenol murders, I think 1980s.
Correct.
Johnson and Johnson just jumped in, did some corporate responsibility, and they made sure that they came up with tamper-proof seals. And then we all know, it has started to, it became the norm after that. So yeah, lots of shining examples like that.
Exactly. And so you mean my point is very simple. My point is that you have to have a mindset, right? You have to have a mindset for quality to say, look, you need to be able to sort of address these issues in the way they ought to be addressed. No process is 100% perfect. It doesn't matter what product you're creating. There will be problems. And the way to address that, to inspire confidence, to build loyalty among your customers, right? That's what we have to focus on. And the problem that we have is that as a industry in India, we play low cost game, right? Our entire premise of our industry is we will sell you the cheapest product. And I'm not giving a buy to the US, purchasers here. The pharmacy benefit managers and the insurance companies that pay for medicines in the United States are largely to blame for that, because they're the one who kind of drive them like to the race to the bottom, right? They're the ones who actually. But the point here is that if you play that game, right, and you hit the bottom and start scraping, where do you go after that? And unfortunately, that's a game that we're playing as a country, as an industry right now. We are playing the game of race to the bottom, right? Without understanding the long-term consequences. And again, I come back to the same notion, which is that if your management's time horizon for return on capital is 24 months, right? You're only worried about the next 2 quarters of what you're going to respond to the market, to the street. You're not looking at building a brand. You're not looking at building a brand for Johnson and Johnson, what it did with Tylenol back in 50 years ago, right? What it did in terms of recalling every product. I mean, it had people rummaging through people's trash to try and find bottles of Tylenol at that point in time. That's how you build a brand, because you're not focused on the next 2 quarters. Because they went out and said, look, we're going to take a massive hit in the next 2 quarters because of this product recall that we're making right now, right? But our eyes are not on the next 2 quarters, but we want to come back to you with a product that you trust, right? That is what is missing. Our investment horizon is the next 2 quarters. We want to be able to tell the street that we've made our numbers. And if that is priority for you, then I don't know if there's anything else to say.
Yeah, yeah, expecting quick turnaround.
Yeah,
Yeah, you rightly pointed out about the death of children in Gambia. I think even in India there were a few deaths because of diethylene glycol, right? The same
correct. Yeah.
same issue that happened in Gambia. And funnily enough, I noticed that only very few media outlets actually covered this news. I saw News Laundry, The Wire, Hindu, and The Guardian, and none of the other so-called mainstream media covered this news. I mean, which also fascinates me on how much influence um, the powerful
Yeah.
have.
So that's another pet peeve of mine, which is that the the reporting, the journalism piece, right? I think that when we think about reporting for health, I think that at least during the COVID, we've seen more people interested in reporting about health issues. But in India, largely, the only time you hear about health reporting when there is a tragedy. Either there's a tragedy of some proportion, some kind, children dying because of encephalitis in UP, or Zika infects a whole bunch of people in Kerala, or the pharmaceutical companies and hospitals actually report their quarterly earnings. That's a regular feature of our health reporting. Or when the Ministry of Health every year they put out their annual homage to the sustainable goals, right? That they'll eradicate malaria in the next 10 years, or eradicate leprosy in this many years, or we have no issue of child stunting. We're great in nutrition. I mean, the kind of nonsense that the ministry puts out, that is the extent of our reporting in health. At least during the COVID, I think what happened was, people paid attention to actual reporting when it comes to health. But the point I'm trying to say to you is, it's unfortunate because our journalism is limited to, sensational stuff. When children die, right? I mean, when the last situation happened in Jammu where 12 children died, right? It was again due to diethylene glycol, right? The same contaminant that killed children in Gambia. But very little in the way of national reporting. Yes, regionally that was reported, covered, but very little in the way of national outreach.
Yeah, interesting segue now that we are talking about contaminants. Bit of a digress, but I noticed that in your book you talk quite a bit about traditional medicine and Ayurveda, and how Ayurvedic so-called medicines have a lot of contaminants in them, and they cause a lot of deaths. I have had trouble making people understand that. Ayurveda is not, scientific medicine. Maybe it was appropriate for its time, but I think in modern day and age, we need modern medicine, which is evidence based. And, you also spoke about efficacy of medicine, right? I mean, I was having a conversation with a science communicator called Pranav Radhakrishnan, and in the middle of the conversation I noticed that nobody really asks for the efficacy of an Ayurvedic medicine. Nobody wants to know that number. What have been some of your findings through your investigative journalism days, so to speak, about the side effects or ill effects of Ayurveda?
It, Actually, Pranav and Abby, they do a lot more work in this space than I do, right? So Pranav purely from a science communication point of view, and Abby, because of his, clinical background and the kind of patients that he sees, he's a hepatologist, right? So he sees people with acute liver injury, people who consume this kind of nonsense that goes under the guise of Ayurveda, and it clinically demonstrates and documents, how badly people get affected by consuming what they call quote unquote safe, natural, medicine, right? The sad part is, I think, there are two issues in my mind. Now, we can talk about why, these so-called concoctions are bad, why they're laced with heavy metals and arsenic, how majority of that is stupid alcohol, and that basically, affects people's liver and stuff like that. But we have a much bigger problem, right? Which I don't think that we understand why that is. The question we have to ask ourselves is, why do people gravitate toward this nonsense, right? Why is it that even well-meaning people, I'm not talking about people who live in villages, right? I can understand that somebody who's not educated, doesn't understand modern medicine, going to a quack and basically saying, hey, you know what, give me something based on Ayurveda. I'm talking about quote unquote educated people, middle class, right? Why do they gravitate toward this nonsense, right? Half the time they say, oh, I'm taking so and so Ayurvedic medicine as well, in addition to taking my regular modern medicine. Why do they say that, right? This is where I think we need to understand. The reason is because if you look at the way that we practice medicine in India, right? Our medical practitioners in India, right? Because of the education system that we have, they just do not have the ability to communicate with the patient with empathy. The sheer number of patients they see, right? You go in to see a consultant, you go and sit there, he shoots or she shoots a bunch of questions at you, asking you about your health and whatnot, takes your vitals and writes a prescription and gives it to you. And next, right? As against that, if you go to one of these people who are supposedly like the BAMS, BHMS people, right? They spend an extraordinary amount of time sitting with you, trying to understand what is your constitution, what do you do, what is your family history. A lot of what patients need is basically some level of empathy. And the practice of modern medicine, for whatever reason, we don't train enough doctors, number one, because this getting into the medical school through and the entrance examination, it's a big hawa happens every year, right? We try and make it so that such a big deal that you get through a medical entrance examination. We don't train enough doctors. For a country of our size, we should have 10 times the number of doctors in the country. Why don't we have enough institutions that actually train that? Is it a question of capacity? Are you saying that we don't have enough people to train this? That's absolute nonsense, right? That's never been a priority for us because we want to create shortage. We want to create this perception that this is a very highly valued, highly trained resource that you go to. They can command a lot of money to try and treat you. The side effect of that is they just don't have the time to be able to spend with you as a patient. 9 out of 10 times, right? When the doctor actually sits down with the patient, spends 20 minutes, you'll realize that the patient needs more that somebody to listen to try and figure out what is wrong rather than getting a list of 15 different medications. Our practice of medicine is what today? Diagnostics, right? The moment you go to a doctor, they'll say, get your blood work done, get your CT done, get your MRI done, come back. And based on that, I'll write a page full of medicines for you. That is our practice of medicine today. Are you surprised that these people don't have the confidence in what they're doing? If they go to the guy who's a BHMS or a BAMS, that guy's going to sit down and say, okay, tell me your family history, tell me your history, tell me when do you get up, what do you do first thing in the morning, when do you go to bed, do you sleep properly, which, a lot of times it's about a conversation. And the skill of clinical medicine is gone. Our doctors don't understand clinical medicine. They understand diagnostic medicine. And then we complain, oh, why do these people go and take all kinds of concoction tinctures? They do because you don't listen to them. Listen to them.
Yeah, it's remarkable how consistent Pranav's answer and yours answer are. I mean, he said the exact same thing, and sometimes I wonder why that is. Like, I think you rightly pointed out, we don't have enough doctors, and I feel like each doctor sees probably 100 patients a day, which is much less in the West. But I live in the US, and I sometimes complain the fact that why does it take such a long time to even get an appointment with a doctor here in the US, whereas I could just take an auto, go to someone, and just tell them my problems. What system are you a fan of, by the way? Like, do you like the Indian system where? Yeah.
No, see, the thing is, I mean, these are two ends of the spectrum, right?
Right.
I mean, for India, right, which is a low and middle income country, aspiring for us to become a United States is a wrong thing to do. It's an absolutely wrong thing, right? This country spends 18% of its GDP on healthcare. Do you think we can afford that in India? 18% of our gross domestic product on medicine? We cannot, right? We're a poor country. We have to be aware of the situation that we live in, right? But that doesn't mean that we cannot have a functional healthcare system. Look at Thailand. Thailand is in the same bucket as us as far as gross domestic product and per capita income, right? They provide much better care to their people compared to us. Much, much better care. Now, the question is this, right? The question is when we had the ability to actually make a significant difference in the way that we provide primary and secondary care, right? Which is large part of our care. Tertiary care, getting surgery is obviously a specialized skill. You need hospitals, operation theaters, specialists and stuff. I'm talking about primary and secondary care. What did we do? We chose the insurance-based model, right? We created Ayushman Bharat and we created PMJ and we said, we will give you insurance cover of 5 lakh rupees, right? For you to be able to use. What was the alternative on the other side? We could have taken the same money and said, we are going to fix our primary health center, the community health centers, and we're going to staff them with proper nurses and paramedics, even if the doctor goes there once a week, right? But these are priorities. For a country of our size and scale and where we are in the development scale, for us to superimpose an insurance-based model of care for us, it's a completely wrong prescription, right? We would have taken the same amount of money. We could have said that every primary and community health center that we have, right? We're going to make sure that it's properly equipped with diagnostics, has a nurse practitioner, BSc nursing available in 2 shifts, right? 8-hour shifts, during the day, a paramedic available for emergencies, right? And a doctor comes in once, a week, so that the person can then monitor, cases that need to be looked at carefully. We'd spend the same amount of money doing that. We would have been able to provide so much better service. Who's benefiting today? The insurance companies are making money hand over fist. Is that what we want?
Yeah, interesting thoughts. Yeah, clearly a broken system. Yeah, you go on to write in your book, The Truth Pill, about you know some data with respect to medical representatives promoting drugs by unethically offering gifts, cash incentives, and so on. I was having this thought about how best is to regulate this and how best is to bring some sort of a foolproof system. And the answer that I end up with is, you just have to trust people, because it's incredibly difficult to build a foolproof system. What have been your findings along your journey about these unethical practices that
Well,
happens?
unethical practices for marketing from pharmaceutical companies are not unique to India. It happens all over the world, right? Happens in this country,
Yeah,
happens in
we
the
just spoke about Biogen, for instance. Yeah.
exactly, right? Happens all the time. The question here is that what is your framework for regulating that information, right? That is the important question to ask. Because in the United States, there's something called the Sunshine Law that basically says that anything over a $25, payment from the pharmaceutical company to a doctor needs to be publicly reported, right? If I, as a pharma rep, buys lunch to a doctor, right? Typical lunch, $15, $20, that's fine. But if I, buy a ticket for the doctor to go to a baseball game, right? Then I need to report that, right? That's what Sunshine Law is saying in this country. And then it's up to the patient to figure out how much of the care that the doctor is providing is under the influence of the pharmaceutical company, right? That information is available. Now, let's go back and look at India, right? We have a similar, code of ethics that governs the conversation, the relationship between a doctor and a patient, a doctor and a pharmaceutical company. But that code of governance is completely voluntary. There are no teeth to enforce it. Now, the question that I have to ask then is that why have the code if you cannot enforce it? Why do you create this perception that there is some measure of a governance structure in place that provides oversight to this conversation between a pharma company and a doctor. Who are you trying to fool? And what is the point of creating a voluntary code? Right? So these are some basic questions that have to be asked, right? And what happens again is that the conversation gets to, into public notice when there is some kind of mishap, some tragedy, some emergency, right? We all talk about how terrible things are, but how hospitals basically abuse patients. They won't return their bodies of their loved ones because you don't settle the bill, or you don't you don't ask why is the doctor writing a prescription for a monoclonal antibody that costs 29,000 rupees per shot compared to I could have gotten regular medicine that would have done pretty much the same thing for me, right? We don't we talk about it usually when it happens to us. When something happens to me or one of my loved ones who basically gets affected by this, I get very angry about it, and I go on Twitter and I write a rant about it, and they get a lot of retweets and stuff like that, and then I forget. Right? I've done my thing. I've ranted. I've created this nonsense around it. Everybody says, "Yeah, it happened to me too. Oh, terrible, terrible thing." 2 days later, we all forget.
Yeah,
Is that how change comes?
that is so true. I mean, yeah, this also brings me to the topic of Central Drugs Standard Control Organization (CDS) CEO. There's been a lot of reports that it's understaffed, underfunded. It limits enforcing capacity, and so on. And there are also numerous examples of drugs banned and restricted in countries like the US and the European Union, which are freely available in India. What are some of the
Sorry.
yeah, no worries.
Yeah.
What are some of the examples, and why is it that the CDSCO is so sort of incapable of regulating these things?
Look, I think that there are enough studies that talk about the competence of the CDSCO and the capacity of the CDSCO. I'm their biggest critic. I always kind of throw stuff at them. I don't envy them. I think that they have a tremendous job ahead of them, and I know that they're not staffed adequately. I know that they need to upskill themselves significantly to try and do justice to the requirement that they have. No two ways about it, right? But at this point in time, I'm actually looking at some very simple things, right? Whatever the limitation you have, whatever function that you're discharging on behalf of people of the country, why don't you be transparent about it? It doesn't take more people for you to be transparent about your actions, does it? Right? Yeah, I mean, your inspectorate staff has capacity to inspect 25% of the manufacturing facilities in India. Given, right? You're not staffed adequately. Given. But those 25 people who actually do inspections and produce inspection reports, what stops you from making them public? Right? I mean, the US FDA sends inspectors from Baltimore. They go to India, they do an inspection, they come back. Within 30 days, their inspection report is available on the US FDA website. Right? This is a different country that's actually inspecting your facility in 30 days, actually telling you, this is what we found, this is where the concerns are, this is what we told the management, this is what they said that they'll do to fix. What is stopping the Indian regulator from doing that? Right? I understand that you don't have enough people. I do understand that you don't have enough capacity. But at least the capacity you have, right? Why don't you make it transparent? Why is the inspection report a state secret? Right? So there are the issue is this, right? I think that like everything else in the country, the CDSCO is run run by bureaucracy. And the bureaucracy is never invested in actually disclosing anything because, God forbid, some layperson question their intent and their decisions. I mean, how dare they, right? The other issue is also the federal structure of the country, right? If you think about how our regulatory structure came about when India became a union, the money that states derive from licensing or manufacturing facilities, states said, look, we want that money, right? So if there's a manufacturing facility in the state of Maharashtra, the state of Maharashtra derives revenue from the licensure of that, right? Same situation goes for the state of Himachal Pradesh, a large manufacturing base there. And so they derive licensing revenue from that. The problem with that is that if the guy in Karnataka, the drug regulator in Karnataka, finds a problem with something that's manufactured in Himachal, there is nothing that person can do other than maybe writing a nice letter to the regulator in Himachal saying, hey, look, we found this medicine, we tested it in our lab, and we found it completely like chalk powder, and your factory is making this, it's making people sick. And the guy who's sitting in Himachal is going to get the letter and crumple it and throw it in the basket because, God forbid, he wants to, he's not going to jeopardize the money he's making out of the licensing of it. So we have systemic problems that we got to fix, right? India is one market. It doesn't take more than a week for a drug manufactured in Himachal to make it to Mizoram, right? And we have to fix this. And it can only be fixed when the parliament gets its shit together and actually passes a proper law. But in the meantime, what is stopping the CDSCO from being transparent about what it is doing?
Yeah, that's quite surprising why they wouldn't make whatever little they do public. It just absolutely makes no sense whatsoever. Um, yeah, I want to touch upon clinical trials conducted in India. They don't seem to offer protection for vulnerable subjects. And sometimes I feel like, in a developing nation, the value for life is much less than the developed world. Why is that? Why is there nobody to question the loss of life due to clinical trial malpractices? And this also stemmed from one of my other discussions with a rural reporter, and who reported about farmer suicides in Vidarbha, and the severe mental health crisis in Vidarbha. Nobody talks about it. It's all the celebrities who get the limelight who talk about mental health. So clinical trials, what has gone wrong, what is going wrong, and how can we improve it?
Look, we just don't have competence to do clinical studies in India. Again, it goes back to the first question you asked is why didn't we develop, a drug of our own? Because we just don't know how, right? How do you develop competence in doing clinical studies? By actually going through the process, right? You go to a big hospital, a government hospital, right, and say, we want to do a clinical study. There are certain things, structural things that have to happen, right? Now, these are developed in some good clinical public hospitals in India because US companies and European companies actually do studies there. So they've learned how to do the stuff, right? You have to have what is called an ethics committee, right? Even before you enroll people into a study of this nature, you have to get approval from the hospital's ethics committee to say, this is the right way to go about doing that. If you go back and look at about 10, 12 years ago, there was a Merck did this study with young females, like babies, and they were using developing this vaccine, HPV, human papilloma virus vaccine. And they enrolled babies into that. That is never, ever done. That protocol would have never been approved in the United States or Europe because there is a strong ethics committee that says, what is wrong with you? Throw them out of the room. If you go back to them with a protocol like that, it got approved because we didn't know any better, right? We'd never done freaking clinical trials. Merck came and said, we want to do clinical trials in this country. Everybody was, wow, Merck is coming to us to do clinical trials. Let's go do clinical trials. Point is this, right? Again, You have to build institutional knowledge. You have to build capacity. You have to build structure. Did you know that when we were developing Covaxin, we enrolled patients of Bhopal gas tragedy to that? Can you imagine that ever happening anywhere else in the world? You know what had happened at that point? And then people inhaled potassium cyanide, right? When you inhale stuff, it goes into your lungs. COVID is a respiratory disease. It also affects lungs. And these idiots in Bhopal enrolled patients who were affected with, who were, essentially sort of descendants of what had happened with union carbide. Can you imagine that happening anywhere else in the world? And when it was reported, it was covered up. It was covered up. My point is this, right? You need institutions. You need to invest in institutions. We don't. Our focus is always about the next quarter, 2 quarters. Our focus is about how do I get better? Do I 5 day take course of this antibiotic? Is it going to make me get better? And after I get better, I forget about what antibiotic I took. My focus is about how do I make sure that I get the best out of the hospital care for my patients or my father or my mother at the moment that they're discharged. I don't give a shit about what happens to other people in the hospital. This is our focus. We do not invest in building institutions, and if you don't invest in building institutions, this is what is going to happen.
Yeah, I think it's remarkable how everything finally boils down to this attitude of jugaad, which is, I think, also a byproduct of what you mentioned about just looking at the first or the next quarter or the next 2 quarters, right? I mean, it is a byproduct of that attitude of jugaad, and I remember talking to Dr. Ajay Shah, a popular economist, and he hates the word jugaad. So yeah, it's all about getting things right and planning long term. I think that's really important, and that's probably one of the things that we need to set right. Um, Dinesh, we spoke about for an hour and 5 minutes, and we haven't touched the main thing that no interview is I mean is complete without touching on that topic, which is the Ranbaxy scandal. Before we end this podcast, I would love to discuss a little bit about that. You were working for Ranbaxy. You were very high up in the ranks, and we have at least from the movies I've seen about how big corporations do a bit of backlash and do sneaky things to whistleblowers, right? How did you gather or muster up the courage to do what you did, and which completely impacted a giant company? $500 million worth of penalties and so on and so forth. It's part of history now. But yeah, how did you muster up the courage?
Well, I mean, I don't know whether it was courage at that time. I think it was probably more stupidity than courage. But the fact is that it did happen that way. And the only thing I can tell you is that you need to have proper role models, in your life. It doesn't matter who you are. If you have people who, are able to kind of keep you in the straight and narrow and help you kind of, focus on what is important in life and look at the larger picture, that gives you the kind of perspective to try and do the right thing the best you possibly can. I was fortunate to have a role model like that in my life at that point in time, who was able to kind of, steer me, to try and look at the bigger picture, do the right thing. And I tried to do the right thing the best I possibly could. So,
Yeah, I mean, going back to that time, I just want to understand how did you come across the fact that or the first signs of something that is just not right in Ranbaxy during your time. Like, what were those first signs?
I mean, that the story has been told many times over, but I was asked by Raj to investigate what was really happening because, he went to Africa to try and talk to their drug regulator because, he was told that he needed to do that. He had joined the company very, very new at that point in time. And the company had received concerns from the South African regulator about the quality of what is being sold in Africa. So when he came back, he's the one who asked me. He said, "Look, I need you to look into this and get to the bottom of it because I'm barely 2 weeks old in this company. And since you have the vision and the breadth of what is really happening from a portfolio point of view, why don't you just dig in and then find out how much of this is true? Because the regulator is telling me that they have serious concerns about the quality of what this company is selling in Africa, in South Africa." And so that is how this whole thing got started.
Yeah, I mean, yet another example of FDA coming to India and inspecting Ranbaxy's plant, right? And found out that the company wasn't following good manufacturing practices, just like how you mentioned. Um, Dinesh, fantastic conversation. And before we end, I just want to touch on what are you spending time on currently? I noticed that you are shuttling between India and the US, but how does your time distribution look like these days with respect to work?
So it's I think since 2018, I run a foundation that works in the health area and civil liberties area in India. So I spend a lot of time, in India to try and, see, what we are able to do to try and move the needle a little bit in areas that I'm interested in. And so we fund a bunch of projects. We try and work in the public policy space to try and help out as best we possibly can. That's what keeps me busy.
Excellent. Dinesh, again, thank you so much for your time. I'll link all your work in the show notes so that people can go check it out and help move the needle or contribute in whatever way they can. So, thank you so much for your time. And I think what you did with Ranbaxy and everything after that is a piece of history. And thank you for doing that for the country and for the people.
Thank you for having me on your show. Enjoy the conversation. Hopefully, something meaningful will come out of it among your listeners. But really enjoyed this talk. Thanks again.